and welcome to the Design Rescue Show, where we take a behind the scenes look at the unique journeys of creative professionals. And we learn about the choices they've made that have shaped their career paths. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us once again to the Design Rescue Show. I am your host, David Block, and with us today, we have Matthew Lindblad. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you today.
Excellent. All right, well, let me just go into a little bit of your background, just give a little rundown of your experience. So you were the founder and creative director of Rebel Revive, which is your rock band in Orange County. And you are the creative, are you still currently the creative producer and the project manager at Knott's Berry Farm?
Yeah, so my title's interesting. They actually call us entertainment designers, but what I do is it's like a creative content producer, and then also cinematographer. And so we create basically all the content that shows up on not socials, that's installed into attractions, and then sometimes even national television ads. So it's a lot of fun.
That is great. I love Knott's. I love it as almost, I'll be quite honest with you, I love it more than Disneyland. I just have to say
Hey,
that.
that's quite all right. I've worked at both, so
Okay. And so you're an operations manager also with Walt Disney Company.
Yeah, yeah. So I was at the Grand California Hotel and Spa is the full name of the resort. I was there for 8 years, so almost a decade. Started kind of as a just part-time student job and ended up being there for quite some time because I loved it so much. So overseeing about I think it was about 60 cast members at any given day.
Wow.
And it's a high-end luxury resort. So we worked with the VIPs all the way to Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, and a wide range of very wonderful guests. So it's fun.
Fantastic. So, and then also you've got experience working with brands such as, and here comes the list. So Coca-Cola, Elf Cosmetics, Mattel, Warner Brothers, Credit Karma, Garnier, Yogurtland, Jim Henson. Oh my goodness. Tesla. And of course, last but not least, you've amassed over 7 billion views on your content. And of course, we're going to get into that a little bit later. Absolutely. I have questions.
Or do it.
Okay. So let me just jump right in. The way that I like to run these videos, I actually like to start all the way back to where you gained your inspiration. So my first question is, even before college, did your inspiration, did you start doing this kind of thing? I know obviously back then we didn't have this technology, but were you a content producer in any way, shape, or form, or did that start when you went to college?
Yeah, so I've been a creative. I would say all of my life. I grew up in a household where my dad was playing in bands, touring, and working at a university here in Southern California. And so I was always around creative environments. So I think I was naturally drawn to the creative arts. But I would say music was my first love. So he would be playing guitar while I was an infant, and I just thought that was so fascinating. I'd crawl over and try to pluck the strings, and before you knew it, I was playing drums. So he bought me my first drum set, and from there, I picked up every instrument I could get my hands on. Started writing songs. I realized pretty quickly that you can't really write songs from drums. There's only so many noises you can make, and so to really formulate a songwriting process, I started learning guitar, and from there, just taught myself everything in the creative world. So, kind of what that looked like is I would write and record songs on this 12-track recorder before Pro Tools, before all the digital technologies that existed. And then once I had the music done, I said, well, I have to make merchandise. I have to design the album cover. And so I started just teaching myself, or kind of primitive versions of Photoshop. I think at the time I was probably in Microsoft Paint as well, just
Nice.
getting
We
different.
all were. I think we all started
Yeah,
there.
exactly. And so just realizing that and this was actually before I even really knew about entrepreneurship and like kind of being your own business and being your own kind of solo creative, but I just realized that there was a necessity for it if I wanted to really get my music out to the world. And so that's kind of how I got my start. Then once, the neighborhood kids saw that I could design like album covers, they were hitting me up to design their artwork, their merchandise, write songs with them, and it just kind of built from there. And so it was a pretty organic process. I would say I spent just endless hours in my basement. So I was at the time living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Toronto, Canada, where basements are a huge part of kind of your household. And so we built little home studios down there, and kind of worked from these interesting little basement corners, just making punk rock and records. So that's kind of how it started.
Awesome. So how did you find yourself going to Middlesex University in London then? If you're all the way over here, how did that happen?
Yeah. So I have ADHD, and so growing up, school was really tough. I wanted nothing to do with like sitting still in a classroom for 8 hours a day, and it was just not really my thing. Kind of early years, and then shortly after high school, I started touring in bands. Playing across the whole whole country, fortunately, which was really exciting. Um, but I started to see the lifestyle that was leading to, in terms of like it's hard to have a family, it's hard to have a substantial job that you can come home to because you're always leaving. And so I ended up going back to school for recording engineering. And so I started at Citrus College, which is kind of up near Azusa area,
Mhm.
the recording program. And in that process, I realized, if I'm studying things that I really love that make me come alive, then I can actually do pretty well at the school thing. Education doesn't have to be impossible. Um, and so I really learned to love just the process of growing my knowledge, growing not only my knowledge, but also my tool set. And so I found a program in London, at a school called Middlesex University in London, where it was geared towards professional students. And so the European system of education is really interesting in that they will help you gain credits by simply doing the job and learning on site with the types of careers that you're interested in. So for me at the time, I was already working at Knott's, and so they said, "Well, what are you learning there, and what can you then learn beyond just what's your normal function at work? What can you actually equip yourself with to do your job better?" And then report back to us those learnings. And so I was writing reports on cinematography. I was writing reports on color grading and how to network, and those sorts of important business functions as a individual creator. And so that's kind of how I found the program. It was through I think my dad had mentioned at one point he had a friend that went there that was a professional musician. But it was just a great experience because I saw myself growing more than I ever have previously, because I was doing education while simultaneously doing the things that I was really interested in, like recording records and creating short films and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's why I ended up going to London all the way over across the pond. Um, and then shortly after that, I was like, well, let me backtrack a little bit. My dad is in education, so it was always his goal to get his kids through college. That was like, he's like, we got to get the kids through. And so once I did that, it's like, well, I've got a bachelor's kind of for them. It helped me, but for them, I wanted to make my parents happy.
Yeah.
Let me just keep going and do one for myself, and just like kind of challenge myself, see how far we can go with this thing. And so, um, at the time, Disney was basically covering entire master's programs through their Aspire program, which is a brilliant thing. If you're a Disney cast member, you got to get involved in Aspire. They cover your whole tuition, books and everything, and
Wow.
give you the opportunity to study for free. Um, and so I decided to go for a master's in marketing and communication management through University of Denver, and knocked that out in 2 years, and walked away with another piece of paper. So it was a big accomplishment to just see that growth from this kid that was ditching class to write lyrics in the park, all the way to graduating at this high level. And so that's kind of what my educational journey looked like.
That's outstanding. So, just tagging on to that, how did your master's degree impact your career at all? Or did it take you in new directions or just continue in the same direction at a higher level?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, um, I kind of strategized it in this way. I already had the tools as a creative. So for example, I knew how to write songs. I knew how to operate a camera. All these sorts of more kind of nuts and bolts type skills. But what I wasn't as familiar with was like how to market myself, how to really communicate effectively as a professional, and go beyond just like, hey guys, I have these skills, like please hire me, to like, okay, I'm now a communications professional. What's that look like to take your business objectives and build creative around that? How do we communicate to the masses, to your designated audience, those sorts of things? And so um, it kind of was a supplemental degree as I kind of look at it. So it really helped me, um, I think, communicate more effectively to like C-suite executives. So when I talk to a CEO from Elf Cosmetics, I can speak their language, but then also turn around and know the nomenclature to talk to the people that are designing, the people like you and I, where it's like we're in the trenches, we're like adjusting fonts and we're moving graphics and we're like to me, the really fun stuff.
Right.
but
Yeah.
but learning how to also dialogue with kind of the more dry, kind of C-suite kind of mindsets, mentalities, and those are exciting too, in a certain way. But I think it's what I've experienced is it's important to know how to converse with all ranges of skill sets, personality types, and what have you. So that's kind of why I chose that, and kind of the skills that it helped me foster and grow.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So let's take a couple steps forward in your career. So in your early career, what projects marked your initial kind of steps into the world of digital marketing and entertainment industry, I should say.
Yeah. So some of my first projects were, well, I would say one of the ones I'm most proud of is I put out a record called 11 through my project Rebel Revive, and Rebel Revive is essentially me. It's the moniker I go by, in which I play all the instruments, write all the music, sing it all. And it's essentially a one-man band on the records. I don't play all the instruments simultaneously. That would be a feat, uh, but once I finished the record, it was kind of back to that, like, okay, it's DIY. It's like, I've in early kind of childhood, I was making records and designing album covers and that sort of thing. Like now I get to do it on a bigger scale because not only am I paying more to make these records because I'm working with producers that are at a higher caliber, um, but also the landscape has changed. So, when I was originally making records, there wasn't really, we were on a website called Pure Volume, which was like early stages streaming. Um, it wasn't subscription based, but you log on to a website and you can stream different songs and what have you. So then going from that to like, how do I get out into the world of Instagram, of TikTok, of YouTube? Um, and so that was one of the earlier projects where I was using all my skills kind of combined. Um, and it really led to some cool results. Like I got songs on K Rock, which is one of the kind of big stations around Los Angeles area and Southern California. Um, and we were nominated for one of the best live bands in Orange County, top 5, which is amazing because I'm like, there's some incredible bands in Orange County, so it was like a great kind of music hub. Um,
Yeah.
Kind of get some of those honors was really exciting for me, and I think one of the biggest payoffs just in terms of you know kind of me being an artist, and but it was challenging that, like, it's a being a solo band is interesting because you're booking yourself, you're trying to book yourself, um, doing all the merchandise, all that thing, or all that side of the business, but then you're also getting the merchandise orders. So you're in there packaging up the orders, you're writing thank you cards, you're doing the whole bit. So It was a really fascinating process, and I still do it to this day. But that was one of the kind of early projects that I feel like was really a staple for all my skills coming together at this level.
Excellent. All right. Okay. And then, as I look through your portfolio, which by the way, I love, it's beautiful stuff that you've got in there. Fantastic work. I noticed that you've got work like, work from Elf Cosmetics, Jim Henson Company, Knott's Berry Farm. They're widely kind of different, vastly different styles of projects, right? Um, I'm sure obviously you've had, very, different experiences with each of them. Could you talk about what you did for Elf Cosmetics versus the project that you did for Jim Henson?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, so with Elf Cosmetics, I was working as a creative producer slash kind of a music director. Um, the brand was wanting to try something new, which hadn't really been done in the beauty kind of space, is to put out an album that revolves around their products. And so it was like at first it was kind of a head scratcher. We're like, how do you talk about lip gloss and how do you talk about blush and these various products in a way that's not the best way I can put it is that's not corny, because it's like you don't want your audience to go, okay, that's a little straight. You know what I mean? It's like there's room for that in certain brands, but
Yeah.
Elf is one of the more popular makeup brands, and so um, they tasked me to kind of accumulate this whole roster of musicians. So what I did was I went through kind of starting with my network, people that I had immediate access to, and asked around and just said, "Hey, who's hot right now? Who's kind of doing the pop R&B kind of rock style? What artists are doing well that are mid tier that aren't like too wild? We're not hitting up the Lizzo's and those sorts of artists because it's like that's just out of the budget, but the mid tier who are artists on the rise." And so I sifted through, I would say, I mean, not exaggerating, probably 500 artists, going through their Spotify's, listening to their records, going, does this match the brand? Is it kind of sassy enough to like fit the makeup world, but it's not too explicit? Or is the production high? Can we get a good performance out of them without too much work? And so just like going sifting through, and so it got down to 5 artists that we decided to work with, and I would be talking to their managers in terms of like, okay, here's the lyrics and kind of some of the ideas that we're working with, and you guys write a song while I'm also negotiating contracts with Elf. And so it was more the I would say kind of creative direction kind of role, so overseeing the entire creative process, which is really fun.
Yeah.
But I would say it is very nerve-wracking because we're talking about handling like multi-million dollar budgets with a lot of these. Um, and so you kind of have to put your business hat on a lot of times. And it's tricky because as a musician myself, I want to fight for the artistry and go, well, no, they wrote these cool lyrics that aren't necessarily beauty brand, but they like, they make you feel something. And they're like, well, we want to say lip gloss and Target in the song. So like, can we maybe change that up? And so it was kind of like navigating those waters. But then with the Henson project, that was really interesting. So I am a huge Muppets fan. I nerd out on Jim Henson products and just like man, some of those old like A Christmas Carol and Muppets Treasure Island and just like Class Labyrinth. I mean, all
Yeah.
these all these classics. And so um, we got invited to my team and I got invited to go to Henson Studios to talk with Brian Henson, Jim's son. And
Wow.
we it was really, really neat. We got invited onto the soundstage where they filmed a lot of these shows and movies, um, and filmed some interviews with Brian talking about his show called Pup It Up, which is like it's stand-up comedy that's kind of mixed with puppets, and so the audience gives phrases and different subject matters and that sort of thing, and then the puppets act it out. and it is honestly hilarious. There's some, you know, more adult themes in there. It's kind of uncut, uncensored type content, but it was just a joy to be there on site and capture some kind of advertisements and some informational interviews with him, talking about his show. And I think really the highlight of the whole experience was not only getting to work with Brian, but also just his hospitality. So he invited us into Charlie Chapman's old office. So if you're not familiar with the Henson Studios, it's on the Chapman kind of old soundstage and studios property. And so he gave us a tour of his office that was, you know, Jim Henson's office before that, and then Charlie Chapman. And so there was
Wow.
just so much history in there. Not only with who had been in that room and used it as a you know, kind of an administrative suite, but also, you know, the walls were lined with old slates and, you know, dark crystal and just all these old, like really cool artifacts from the movies. And then, you know, he has all his awards that he are just collecting dust. He's like, oh yeah, those old things, you know, and I'm like,
Right.
you know, this is legendary. And so it was a really neat experience. And then we were fortunate enough to have the show at Knott's for 3 years as well during Knott's Scary Farm. So we got to dialogue and work with him quite a bit more as well while he was at the parks. But yeah, it was a really special experience. And I think it's, for me, a lot of times those in between conversations, it's not always the conversations that you have while the camera's rolling, but the ones that you have while the camera's off, and you're just interfacing with incredible creatives that are just you know, I mean, especially with Brian, a historical family in the entertainment industry. And so that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of how it looked different. So on that particular project, I was more of a cinematographer, making sure pictures looking great and making sure we're you know, kind of directing his lines and saying, hey, why don't you, you know, maybe smile a bit more. You know, you look a little angry about these puppets. Like, can we try lightening it up? Or is there a place to crack a joke? Or kind of directing what's actually captured,
Yeah.
uh, which is equally fun and a lot less stressful, quite honestly. Like, I think being on set is a kind of a more safe space for me.
Okay.
It's like, you know, okay, let's roll. And like, then really once you get all the lighting set up, it's really on the performance.
Yeah.
Whereas like negotiating some of those multi-million-dollar contracts, it's like, that's, you know, it's pretty you know, pretty intimidating stuff. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the contrast of those two.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, widely different. That's what I thought. Very different. And so and then, of course, you know, I'd love to hear about your experience. Now, you talked a little bit about what you do at Knott's, and I'd like to hear what you do at Disney and how they similar sort of situations?
It's interesting. They're incredibly different. Like, they could not be any more different. It's really fun. So at Disney, it was purely operational. Like, I would say probably 0% creative.
Got
Um,
it. Okay.
but that was where I grew the most in terms of my leadership skills, my ability to navigate tough guest issues, um, which interestingly enough, I think goes hand in hand with like navigating tough client issues. So a lot of times it's um, you know, hey, we're on revision 5 of this video edit. You know, can we maybe get 5 more revisions? And it's like, it's not, you know, that's not really what we agreed to, or like, you know, just kind of navigating those sorts of situations, whatever it may be. There's obviously a wide variety. But that's where I really honed those skills, because you get a lot of interesting guests through there, but kind of as I mentioned at the top, it's like you get some really high profile guests as well. So, you know, I've worked with anyone from Mark Hamill, like Luke Skywalker, to Kobe Bryant, to you know, Mariah Carey, to like John Williams. I mean, all these people have come through our hotel and I've had one-on-one encounters with. And so being able to navigate that in a way that is I think respectful. You always want to be respectful to your guests, but also what I try to kind of keep in mind is like be human with them. Because it's funny. My friends are always like, "Man, you meet all these celebrities and you do this and that. Like, don't you freak out?" I'm like, "No, I mean, it's these are incredibly, incredibly talented people and historied people, but I think when you treat them as humans, I think a lot of respect comes through that. And so, one of the funny examples that I give at at Disney was I was bringing bags up to Kobe Bryant's room, and I'm 6'5", so like fairly tall. He's like I think he was 6'6" or something around there, maybe 6'7", and so like not that much taller. And so I think it was coming up to his room, and I said, "Where do you want your bag, shorty?" And like because high level, and he's not used to. I mean, obviously on the court, he's used to like tall, taller people, but in public, he's always the tall guy. And so
Yeah.
having kind of taller guy come in and be like, he joking around with him, and he gave just the classic like Kobe kind of look and smirk. He's like, "That's pretty good, man." Like put him right there, and was just so personable, which is really cool. And so just having those experiences, I think taught me a lot on just how to be human in those kind of what would typically be uh kind of intense situations.
Right.
Another funny one real quickly was
Yeah.
dancing with I danced with Tom Brady in the elevator on the way down to the Valley Drive. So it was so goofy, and um it's hard not to just like crack up, or like just because you're like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing athlete, like one of the best in the world. And you're just like, how did I find myself in this situation? And so uh, his son was playing some sort of like music on TikTok, or there was like a funny dance. And so I just was like, I'm gonna dance along. And so I just like started getting down. And then Tom was like, "Oh, he's got the moves." And we started like dancing around and stuff. And it was just like it was a funny shared moment that I don't think a lot of people really get to have with some of these higher end celebrities. And so I just learned, I would say, kind of tact and just how to be human in those situations at the Grand, especially under pressure. Overseeing so many cast members, it's like, and so many different personalities. Um, it's it can be, pretty tough in certain situations, like especially around the holidays. We're moving, we have 1,000 rooms there, so we're moving 1,000 rooms and getting bags in and out of there, and in the same time as navigating some visiting groups like Blizzard Entertainment would come in and have their holiday party, or
Right.
all these different like high end groups. And so it was wild. It showed me how to work efficiently and effectively in those high profile environments. And then at Knott's, kind of the contrast is that's fully creative. So there's like I'm not overseeing really any teams. It's more of like overseeing creative assets. And so um, we are typically tasked with something around like between 50 and 100 assets each year to film them, to edit them, to color them, sound design, everything. And then a lot of times even conceptualize. So we'll be given a prompt. For example, like this year we had a maze that was coming in called Cinema Slasher, which is for our Not Scary Farm event. And the whole concept of the maze was you walk into this haunted cinema and walk through the movie into the movie. So like you're actually walking through a movie theater with the chairs and the big screen and all that stuff. And then you see the film on the screen, and as you walk through the middle of the screen, it splits, and then you're inside the film. And
Wow.
so we were tasked with the you know kind of I guess responsibility of how do we let guests walk into a film. It's like, are because we can't build the full like set that they see on the screen, because it's like we were using Independence Hall across the street from Knott's Berry Farm, like this historic building. We're using that as a frat house to make it look like a frat, or like some sort of college party, and like had people dancing up in the window, and then the slasher comes out of the front door and everyone's running and screaming, and whatever the horror tropes. But it's like we can't literally have them walk into Independence Hall, so like how do we make it feel like it's the same world that they're walking into, and that sort of thing. So we actually just take those um kind of primitive concepts of like you're walking into a film, and then actually turn them into full scale um immersive environments through video, through prop building, that sort of thing. So um, that's kind of what that looks like and like some of the projects that we work on. And so for that maze, we made 3 different like films. They're like short films essentially that are probably about 30 seconds long, but filmed them as if it's a Hollywood movie. And so we got like, cranes out there lighting the whole set. We had, cameras in motion, different directions and actors and the whole bit just for this fake film, which is pretty wild. So it's really a joy to work on those sorts of projects. And you know, it's always an interesting day because you never know what to expect there. A couple years back, we had to go film a live beehive, or like we went to like a bee farm essentially, and so we needed a whole frame filled of bees that we could project on one of our maze walls. And so guests walk in and they see just these massive bees like swarming the room. And we're like, well, we can't find any stock footage, so let's go out and actually film real bees.
Wow.
So it's always interesting at Knott's, just the variety of content we get to work on. And then, we do everything from that to then like social media content of like our Christmas tree lighting and like that sort of thing. The more, I think, kind of what you'd expect from a theme park, where it's like guests enjoying treats and that sort of thing, which is fun. But I really enjoy getting to make small horror movies and that sort of thing too.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it was a very, very different contrast. But I think there was skills really, I think instilled in me from both parks, and both experiences. I would say I learned like proper filmmaking at Knott's Berry Farm. I originally just interviewed there to be a sound technician working one of their shows. And my trainer, this guy, Jared Almond, who's a filmmaker and a director, just put out his first feature film on Amazon. Shout out to him. Um, and he basically taught me the ropes. He said, "Hey, I know you're training to do this sound thing, but like, are you interested in like horror movies and like filmmaking?" And it's like, yeah, I don't know anything about it, but I will show up on set. Like, you don't even have to pay me. I'll volunteer. And he's like, well, no, 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 we'll make sure you get paid. But, like, come on by and maybe you can hold like a boom mic and you can, maybe pull focus or some sort of, kind of, well, I wouldn't say focus pulling is introductory, but like, some kind of more PA type work. And just by being on set, they trusted me more and more to, to perform at the level that they needed. And then eventually, time flew by and now I'm the main cinematographer there. I do all the camera work.
Wow.
So yeah, it's been an interesting journey between the two parks. But that's kind of what it looks like.
If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you. So now I just want to say, you've already talked about Rebel Revive a little bit. I caught your MTV Cribs show 10 years ago. I had to mention that. Fantastic.
So that's fun. I know you mentioned up front, like, kind of diving into some old interviews and checking out like what hasn't been asked. And so that's a hilarious one. I often forget that's on YouTube, but every time I come across it, I was like, this has to stay. We'll keep this. Such a funny thing. So
Yeah.
quick story about that. My friend, one of my best friends, Laura, she lives in Canada. But I met her out in California and she had heard about this place called the Salton Sea, which if you're not kind of familiar with it, it's out towards like kind of Coachella, Palm Springs, that area. And it's a really interesting place because half the kind of like motorhomes and buildings and what have you there are just completely abandoned and like thrashed. Some of them are, like graffiti artists came in and like did graffiti on there. But then there's still some people like further inland that are living in the neighborhood and they're riding around on motorbikes, like, and just like checking out the scene. It feels post-apocalyptic is the best way to put it. And so we went out there to do a photo shoot. She's a YouTuber. And so we did a photo shoot for her YouTube and kind of just explored the area, almost like urban adventure type, but it's not urban. It's more ramshacked rundown. And so we're wandering out there and we found this, I I don't even call it a house. I mean, it's like it was like an abandoned like kind of shack slash garage type thing. Totally emptied out, you know, graffiti all over the place. But there was like remnants of um people living there. There was like this old TV. There was like just a mattress like randomly left out there. Just it's really obscure. And so we're kind of like, well, we should do like a total spoof on MTV Cribs. And so I like straight face delivered this like my name's Matthew and this is my crib and did the whole gimmick and we filmed different scenes of it, you know. They always bring you in the bedroom and this is where the magic happens and you know just like the cheesy lines and so I was like we got to hit all of them and so we did the like this is, you know, here's my bedroom and it's just like this mattress in the desert. Uh we did like this is my brand new TV and it's like these I think it's like these two old TVs stacked on each other that like clearly are busted up. And then my favorite we did this like this bit where we are in I think like what was originally the garage of this old rundown place and there was this like it was like a Barbie toy car, those like old school ones that are like battery powered and you, like kids sit in them. And so I fit my whole self inside this tiny little plastic car. I was like, this is my new whip, and like just joking around. And so
Nice.
that's that is like I think the if you get to know me and like to the people that have worked with me, I love just making people laugh. And even if it's at the expense of like making myself look like a fool, I do it, I feel like I do it tactfully. So it's nothing is too like, you know, bombastic, but
Right.
I just love like making people laugh and making people just go, "Oh my goodness, like this guy is such a goofball." And so that was one of those instances.
Well,
And
I have to say, I didn't want to take anything for granted. So it took me a little bit, maybe about 20 seconds to realize this is not real. At first, but you opened it up and it looked so real at first, like, oh my gosh, you made it on Cribs.
so yeah, I love doing those kind of like mashups too. I I think I use like the actual intro of Cribs to like lead into it, so it kind of gave it that realistic feeling too. And so I love doing that sort of thing. I also you know, kind of on that note, just the kind of creative mashups or like kind of spoofs or whatever. I even started a little t-shirt company that does mashup designs of like video game characters and like rock bands. And so like one of my favorite video games as of late is this game called Overwatch that's made by Blizzard and it's kind of like a team-based first person shooter type thing and you know, I just mash up some of their characters with like, you know, Motorhead or like Nirvana or Dead Kennedys and all these old punk bands. And so I love doing that kind of thing where it's like taking something that people are already familiar with and then like putting a new spin on it and kind of you know, bringing together gaming and rock and like making these new worlds. So yeah, I think I've got quite a few of those types of projects under my belt and it's great practice. Like that's kind of what I found too is like even if it's well let me step back for a second. Like yesterday I was doing an informational interview with a student in Toronto, Canada. He's a brand new design student. He's like, where do I start? I just said, you just jump in and start creating. I mean, it's like people aren't going to hand you the signed check right away, but if you accumulate a lot of work, a lot of variety, they can then picture you as the person to hire. And so that's kind of where I got a little bit of a start in design too, is that I would just mock up these shirt graphics, these mashups, and you know, at first it was like, well, you know, I'll show friends, I'll show friends that play the game, and then it became like, oh, people are actually interested in buying these things, so start a little store, and yeah, it's fun. It's just like you never know what's going to come around when you start creating. So yeah.
Right. And that's actually really good advice. Just you know, create, just get out there and start it. When I started when I started building a portfolio, when I was in college, I asked, you know, my one of my instructors, well, how do I get seen? How do I get known? He just said, build your portfolio as though you've got a crowd watching you, and then they'll come. Eventually, they'll see the amount of content that you've created, and exactly as you said, they can picture you doing their work, or you know, or at least you can, you know, open doors.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that's a really good advice.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, do the work as if there's millions of people watching. I mean, yeah, that's kind of been the story of my career too. I would say especially in music. So, with Rebel Revive, no one really knew. I was coming off of a band that had played on Vans Warped Tour and some bigger kind of national tours. Um, but so I had a little bit of a start, but I was starting from scratch. And so that's kind of what made me decide to spend a little bit more on like a producer that's going to make me sound like these artists that I really want to be touring with, and that I really want to be seen as this high quality um, type artist. And so I think if you're doing quality work and really um, putting the love into the craft, I think the outcome is observed as if you are already on that level. and and that's kind of been, I mean, interestingly enough, that's how I got the job at the marketing agency that led me to these bigger projects like Warner Brothers and Elf and all these things. Is like, hey, I work at Disney. And it wasn't even a creative role. It was just like, I'm an operations manager. Um, but they said, well, okay, like let's see what you got. And so I showed them my record and I showed them these music videos I've done. And it's like projects that are all over the place, but they just went, this guy puts a lot of love into these projects. Surely we can trust him with Warner Brothers. So,
Yeah,
it kind of worked out, but
that's
um,
great.
yeah, portfolio is key.
Absolutely.
and,
Absolutely.
and I tell all the students that I meet with, I've spoken at Cal State Fullerton out here twice this year, and I'm always telling people like, show your work. That is like, resume is great. If you can build your resume, more power to you. If you're in the creative field, like, I don't want to say resume doesn't matter. It is also important,
Yeah.
but portfolio is king. And being able to like showcase your work, especially right now for me, I'm kind of in a job search. Excuse me. We've scaled back a little bit in terms of the work available for me, the hours and that sort of thing. And so I'm kind of looking at what else is out there and seeing if there's maybe a career move and what have you. But just being able to showcase the breadth of your work in 30 seconds or a minute is crucial. So I made these sizzle reels that are like all my cinematography work and then all my creative production work. And it kind of showcases a lot of the brands I've worked with.
Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Lip gloss on, the night is young and I'm ready to play. Yeah, jingle bells.
Courtney, yeah, she's the coolest. I think we should take a trip to 1986. Hey, yeah, yeah. I wanna dance like Courtney. Favorite products check.
This one. Got all I need right here.
Sending those to recruiters and sending those to potential clients has been a dream. Like, they're just like, oh, okay, this is like high quality stuff. And honestly, like, it's interesting. The actual outcomes are just like, some of them are silly TikTok videos. It's like a dance video, like with Mattel around a song that I helped like, produce and that sort of thing. But I actually then went in and animated all the cover cards too. So like, it would be like one of them is zooming into this old school TV and it's like the American Girl doll that we wrote a song for, and she's like in front of a Pac-Man arcade machine, like, funny enough. And just animating different elements to kind of keep people entertained, I think is another kind of cool way to show your portfolio. Even if the thing being shown itself isn't necessarily the project that you worked on, kind of having some introduction into the product or the service that you help to promote is kind of cool. So yeah, portfolio.
Absolutely. So now moving on to another question, the elephant in the room. You know what I'm getting to here. So it's amazing. It's remarkable that you've amassed over 7 billion views on your content. I'd love to hear about that. What kind of content can reach that many views?
Yeah. So I was working with a marketing agency called Movers and Shakers, and they are titled one of the fastest growing agencies in all of the US. That's from, I think, Adweek, kind of provided that information, that data point. But it really is impressive. I was one of the first 20 employees for the agency. It was started by two gentlemen, and one was a Harvard business grad, and the other was I think a dancer singer, kind of comes from more the theater world. And so they had this cool dynamic, and they're brilliant CEOs and executives, Evan and Jeffrey. And so I was working under them at the kind of infancy of this startup called Movers and Shakers. And so they were taking on clients that were massive because, once again, like, of their portfolio. They had gotten a couple brands under their belt and then just built this amazing looking portfolio and website that made brands like Warner Brothers go, oh, we want to work with them. And it's like, it's incredible that you can get that attention so early on in your company. And so they brought me in to produce, and some of the first projects that I was on were that Elf Cosmetics record, Mattel, and then this really interesting project for Warner Brothers. So one day I was working on the Garnier campaign for I think it was a couple TikTok videos for Garnier. And it was kind of crunch time. It was like, things are due like this week. We need to get it to the client so they can post it on the channels and what have you. And so I'm like head down working all day long. And I get this little bloop from Jeff, and my creative director, and he's like, hey, kind of have an emergency. And I was like, well, hold on, what? And he's like, yeah, we have a Warner Brothers asset that's due in 2 hours. Can you help them finish the creative on it? So I was like, okay, like, what is it? Like, where is it right now? Like, is it half built? Is it like, and they're like, no, we need like basically the whole thing sound designed. I'm like, okay. So I met with the people over at Warner Brothers. They said, here's what we have. We have some cackles from Anne Hathaway for this movie called Witches that was going to go on HBO Max. We have a couple little like assets here and there. It's like spooky music. We need you to like bring the whole thing together. And so over the next few hours, I sound designed it. I mixed it. I was getting in and like writing little pieces of music, like bring this whole thing together for this paid campaign, and got it off to the team, the account team, and they posted it, and I thought nothing of it. And so, next few days I was on TikTok kind of browsing as one does, and come across this familiar sound. It's like, oh, that's interesting. That's my work. And that's on Warner Brothers channel. Okay, interesting. And so I start clicking through, and little did I know that at that point, I think it already had like something like 2 or 3 billion views.
Oh my goodness.
So I was just like, I ran into like the living room, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at this. Like, it has 1 billion views, like billions of people have heard my work. And so it kind of started from there. And then more and more people started using the TikTok sound. They started creating their own kind of promo. We call it like UGC, user generated content.
Yeah.
Start creating their own UGC, and like anywhere from these, like the celebrities that are in, the actors and actresses that are in the movie, to just influencers. Everyone started using it. And I think last time I checked, it was at like 6 billion views. So that's how I got quite a few billion. And then a lot of the other ones were like the Mattel campaign did something like 150 million views. across all my work at Knott's, there's been, I think, a few 100 million views. So it just like, different projects do different numbers. And I think that too is just, it kind of speaks to like what the objective is. Is it to get views? Is it to get ticket purchases for the park? Like what it is. And not everything is like a paid campaign, but a lot of these paid campaigns have pretty substantial marketing budgets. And so they would put hundreds of thousands of dollars, behind the marketing. And so that means that many more million people seeing my work, which is really, really cool.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just been this kind of interesting experience. I never really pictured myself in the content world and like, marketing for major brands. I think a lot of, like I said, my upbringing was this kind of creative nerd playing music and making movies, skate videos, all sorts of stuff back in the day. But I realized that like, all these skills really give me leverage to work with major brands. It's like they need people that can not only do the creative but speak their language too. And so I think that's why it got there. So it's like 6.7 last time I checked across all my work. But yeah, I'm not stopping there. So
That's awesome. So I have one final question. We've come to the end of the show, and before I ask, I just want to say once again, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here and sharing your story with everybody. I appreciate that.
yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And I always tell people we're giving our stories to be shared. So
Yeah.
I think I've been fortunate enough to get invited onto shows like this. So I appreciate you.
Absolutely. So my final question. So in your career, you've cultivated a wide range of skills, experiences. If you were to give new students or students that are just coming out of college advice in getting into the the world of digital media and entertainment, what would that advice be?
So I reflect on my career, and I think the advice that I accidentally took without knowing is put yourself on a ton of projects. Just get out there and start creating. I'm a very outgoing guy. I'm, extrovert, but I would say that there is still a part of me that goes, "Ooh, I don't know. I don't know how to, do SEO, like, search engine optimization for this project, or I don't know how to sound design for a video game. I've never done that." There's a point that everyone is at that stage, and that's something we have to keep in mind is that like we were all beginners at some point, like everyone from George Lucas to like Oprah Winfrey to and you name it. I mean, the list is endless of people that just went, you know what, I'm gonna try this out, and then they rose to the occasion. So I would say get out there and don't be scared to create. That's one major takeaway. An example of that is, and I've given this idea a couple times, so I'm curious to see if it ever gets made. But one example is like, hey, if you want to be a content creator for Disney, go out and create the type of content that you see Disney making, and then show them. Be like, this is what you guys are making. Like, here's my version of it. Here's some ideas that can build upon that. And so like one example that I've given, I really want to go out and film this next year, is that see if you can ride all the rides at Disneyland from A to Z, like in order. So you're running all over the park as quick as you can, trying to get to all these different rides, and film that process. And then you have an asset to put on TikTok, on Instagram Reels, on, wherever. And it's of you creating for the brand essentially. And so just going out and creating this style of content that they're making and then adding your own flavor to it is one major thing. Because you're not always going to get invited to create the content. That's just the reality. They're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to hire people that have been doing it their whole lives. And so how do you get started? You start. You just jump out of bed and go, today I'm making something.
Right.
So that's a big takeaway. And then I think with that is saying yes to projects that make you you know, I don't want to say make you a little scared, but like, you know, that challenge you. A lot of the projects that I was on, if someone said, "Hey, we need you to sound design for Warner Brothers in 2 hours for an asset that's going to get seen by 6 billion people," I'd be like, "Oh, nope, I'm out." You know,
Right.
that's a lot of pressure.
Yes.
But by saying yes to that project and challenging myself in that way, I experienced exponential growth. You know, these kind of just fun data points that I get to share in interviews and with students that I'm talking to and that sort of thing. And so, say yes to the projects that challenge you. And if you don't know how to do it, like learn by tomorrow. That's the other thing I tell people is like the you know, my kind of story with my cinematography at Knott's Berry Farm. I didn't know how to work a camera, like especially a cinema camera. It seems kind of complex. It's like it's manual focus. I don't know how to light a set, you know, all those things in the early stages. But by being on set, being in that environment, and saying yes to something that challenges me, I'm now where I'm at, getting to work with these brands and create this high caliber of content. So those are a couple. And then one of the things that I try to keep in mind too is that you each day you have the choice to be a student. So we can go through life going, "Ah, I know it all. I don't need to be in you know, this class, right? You know, oh, like, you know, this design class with this cool dude like with a sick mustache. I don't know, but no, it's like we have the exciting opportunity to sit into this class and get to grow again our tool set, our skills, our knowledge, and then go out into the world and use those things. And so I just like to consider myself a full-time student, even if I'm not in a class, just like learning and absorbing. And my iPhone is full of like 5,000 notes of just like, you know, a portion of a book that I read or, you know, a video that I saw on YouTube, and just amassing knowledge and information that inspires me. And I think that's how you get to the level of the Disneys, the Warner Brothers, the, you know, all these major brands, if that's kind of the way you choose, or just even starting your own company that does really well and doing that full time. That's completely okay too. It doesn't have to be with a major brand. You get to start your own thing. And now more than ever is the opportunity to do that. I mean, social media is free, and putting content out is free. And so, you know, hit people up and say, you want to design, need a music video filmed, record produced, whatever. But get yourself out there and start creating.
Beautiful, beautiful. Very, very good advice. Yeah, before I go, I do want to say, you know, I absolutely agree with what you said about it's kind of like I feel like it's like a fake it till you make it sort of situation especially in my early career. When people asked for something, I didn't know it, I would learn it. And if I didn't do it, then, you know, who else is going to do it? Somebody else is going to get that money. I'm going to jump in with both feet and see if I can do it. The worst that'll happen is I fail and I find out that it's something that I'm not capable of doing.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's better to put yourself out there, push yourself. Better to go that far and pull yourself back and find out that you can't do it than to never go there.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And just to kind of piggyback on that real quick, so I always heard the fake till you make it. And I stopped identifying with that.
Yeah.
I now say do it until you become it. Because it's like there's never a time where I just wake up and I'm like, you know what, today I'm a cinematographer. It's like, no, you just do the actions that then lead to the outcome. You do it until you become it. And that's kind of what, you know, no one told me I get to be a musician. I was like, okay, I'm a musician. I'm going to start doing, you know, playing the instruments and writing songs and just doing it until I go, okay, now I identify as, you know, kind of having the skill set and the passion and the abilities to do this thing as a musician or as a filmmaker, what, you know, even as a designer for the students. It's like, you know, just doing it till you become it. There's nothing fake about practicing your skills.
You're right.
It's like you're getting in the trenches and you're in Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator, all those things, and it's like you're doing what all the other professionals are also doing. You're doing it at a introductory level, and then you just slowly build the skills or quickly. I mean, some people, learn them really quickly and it just catches on. But yeah, I definitely I agree 100%. It's that. And you just keep doing the art, keep being creative, and it'll catch on, you know. And I think we all, even if you're like just a businessman or woman, or you're just like in some super dry industry, you're a lawyer, you're a whatever, I think everyone actually is an artist, and has some sort of artistry inside. And so whether it be design or anything else, I think just finding out what that is, what's that kind of piece of you that when you paint or when you do one of those crafts that makes you feel, alive. And it doesn't even have to be seen by the world, but just enjoying art as art. And so, yeah, I very much agree. So,
All right. Okay. Well, once again, thank you for being here. And it was very nice to meet you.
yes, likewise. Thank you so much for having me, and really grateful for spending time with you.